All right then. So we have the colony of Jamestown, and later the larger, which grows into the larger colony of Virginia, firmly established by 1609. The Pilgrims land at Plymouth Rock and established the Plymouth colony in 1620. Other Puritans established the much larger Massachusetts Bay colony in 1630. A couple of years after that, another new colony is established, the colony of Maryland, which was established by an English noble named Lord Baltimore, who was Catholic. And as I said, kind of like the acceptability of Catholicism kind of goes up and down over this basically 50-year period. Well, he's able to be openly Catholic, yet Catholic people are being persecuted in England. So his initial idea was to get a charter for a colony that would be a haven, a sanctuary for English Catholics, where they could go and live and practice their religion freely. So that's how it got the name Maryland. However, it wasn't confined only to Catholics. Other people moved there. So, unsurprisingly, within a short time, there were lots of religious fights going on in that colony. And it sort of switched hands a couple of times away from the Baltimores when Catholicism fell way out of favor again, and then back to the Baltimores. Anyway, you got the colony of Maryland in the Tidewater region, right there north of Virginia, and very similar to Virginia. There's a lot of tobacco production that goes on there in Maryland. Well, just about a year before the establishment of the Maryland colony, a young Englishman arrived at the Massachusetts Bay colony, a young Puritan pastor named Roger Williams. And it's going to turn out Roger Williams, who's there to lead a congregation, is different from other Puritans of the time and of the region. Different in that he actually believes in religious freedom as religious freedom. That is to say, not like the other Puritans who want religious freedom for themselves, but then want the freedom to deny it to other people living within their boundaries. He believes that religious freedom is a concept that should be honored, that everyone should have the right to worship God as they choose. He also believed that the church and the state should be separate. Now, there was no separation of church and state in the Massachusetts colonies. The church was the state, was the church. So he thinks that church and state should be different. He also believed that no one specific denomination was the special elect or chosen of God, which kind of flies in the face of everything the Puritans believed. They believe that they are the elect. Remember that Calvinistic predestination. And he's saying, well, no, not really. People can go to heaven that are not Puritans. And perhaps the wildest thing that he proposed, and the most unpopular thing that he proposed, was the idea Indians should be treated fairly as if they were human beings. Now, why was this so unpopular? If you think about all the cheating that went on, the lying and the cheating and the stealing from Native Americans in New England from day one, essentially, it may seem very hypocritical because this is supposed to be a theocratic government, a government ruled by the dictates of Christianity, which would seem to work against lying all the time and stealing. However, because the Puritans believed Indians were savage, heathen agents of Satan and therefore the enemies of God, lying to them, stealing from them, and cheating them was actually considered a good thing. In fact, many Puritans would consider it a sin not to do those things because it's God's enemies. And here comes Roger Williams saying, I don't know where he gets stuff like this, but love your enemies and be kind to people and be fair to everyone. So, like I said, those are not the sort of things that were generally believed by the Puritans who had established these colonies. So, not surprisingly, within 5 years after he got there, he was banished. He was kicked out of the Massachusetts colony and forbidden to ever come back. So he left, and several followers of his went with him, and they established a new colony in 1636, the colony of Providence. Now, Providence, there's a word that you used to see a lot in 18th, 19th century books that you don't see very often anymore. In fact, I bet many of you are not familiar with that word and what it means. Providence. Providence means provided by God. So that's what he called his colony, provided by God. Within a few years, the larger colony in that area, the name would be changed to the colony of Rhode Island. Providence, of course, still a city in Rhode Island, one of the only cities in Rhode Island. So in the Providence colony, later called Rhode Island, the church and the state were separate. Religion and citizenship had nothing to do with one another. You could become a citizen of this colony no matter what brand of Christianity you espoused. Now, when we're talking about tolerance and religious freedom, remember, in most cases, it's talking about of other Protestant denominations. Sometimes, by a great stretch of magnanimity, they will include Catholics, but usually it still doesn't include non-Christians. Anyway, Rhode Island under Roger Williams, you could be a Protestant any which way that you wanted to. All right, another important figure from this time period who showed up in Massachusetts not too long after Roger Williams did was a woman named Anne Hutchinson. She arrived with her husband in 1634. Anne Hutchinson, like Roger Williams, did things differently than other Puritans. One of the things she did differently was that she taught Bible study classes, despite the fact, the glaring and obvious fact that she possessed a vagina. She taught Bible classes and even presided over meetings in her house. So there's people coming to the house of a woman and being preached to. And among the things that she was preaching was the idea that being elect, that is, being a person who's going to heaven, is a state of grace that is not evidenced by external actions. What does that mean? That means how much stuff you have, how much material success you have, does not indicate whether you're going to heaven or not, or how good of a Christian you are. And in fact, she called many of the local ministers hypocrites. She was accused of antinomianism. By the way, that's not on the study guide. You don't have to remember that. But antinomianism is the theological crime of putting your own judgment above that of the church and the state. And this is Massachusetts, so they're the same thing. So in other words, daring to question the authorities when it comes to religion. Well, in the middle of all this, while she's being investigated and charged with this stuff, she goes like one step beyond the straw that broke the camel's back, in that she claims to be divinely inspired by God. She claims God's Spirit directs her. She claims that she hears the voice of God. Now, this was heresy to the Puritan leaders because, for one thing, if anybody was going to hear the voice of God, it would be them. They hadn't heard anything. And for another thing, if anybody was going to hear the voice of God, it would be a masculine anybody, not a woman. So she was arrested for sedition. Remember, we talked about sedition before. That means treason. So believing something different from what the Puritan church teaches counted as treason against the state in the Massachusetts colony. She was excommunicated, that is, kicked out of the church, and banished, that is, kicked out of the colony, just like Roger Williams had been. So she leaves, again, with several followers, and they establish a new colony to the north of the colonies in Massachusetts at a place called Portsmouth that later becomes the colony of New Hampshire. Later on, after her husband died, she moved out of the English colonies completely and moved into the New Netherland colony, the capital of which was New Amsterdam, that was run by the Dutch. And she was living in the Bronx, which is a Dutch word, when the Bronx was attacked by Native Americans, and she was one of the people who was killed. So, attacked by Indians in the Bronx, maybe not what we expect to happen in the 21st century, but very much a problem in the 17th century. Well, if we're going to be talking about dissidents, we have to talk about this guy, George Fox, who was not an English colonist, although he visited the English colonies in North America later on in his life. He was an Englishman who spent most of his life in England. And toward the end of the Puritan reign, during and immediately after the English Civil War, started his own religious approach and started to gain followers. His approach he referred to as the Religious Society of Friends, that was known colloquially as the Quakers, because there was a lot of emphasis on quaking before the Lord, quaking in fear before the Lord. And there were a lot of differences in the Quaker approach. Quakers tended to be pacifists, to oppose war in any form for any reason. Quakers tended to proselytize. They tended to go about and try to seek converts to their denomination. In Quaker churches, women had the right to speak in church, so Anne Hutchinson would have been much more well received by Quakers. Quakers rejected the idea of predestination. They did, however, believe in the inner light, that thing that is an evidence from within that you are blessed by God. Quakers were heavily persecuted in England and later in the New England colonies when they started to show up there, because they were so different. Another thing that they proposed, by the way, was being honest and trustworthy and kind. They tended to emphasize the importance of, kind of like Roger Williams had, being friendly and fair to the Indians. They did not initially come out as anti-slavery, but individual Quakers were among the first colonists in the New World to do so. So essentially, they were there being all Jesus about stuff that English people were really attached to, which was their own way of doing things. And non-Quakers didn't like it, especially the authorities, especially in this era when religion was so closely connected with government. So, in New England and in England, Quakers were often imprisoned just for being Quakers, and they were really persecuted for proselytizing and trying to seek converts, taking members away from the more established denominations, the official denominations. So, in New England, if you were caught being a Quaker, you might be put in jail. If you were put in jail for being a Quaker, you were branded on the face with the letter H for heretic, which of course means like a religious denier or backslider or something along those, an apostate. So branded in the face with an H. Sometimes Quakers were executed. By the way, this same treatment was also extended in the Puritan colonies of New England to Baptists. They really didn't like Quakers and Baptists. All right, well, now let's talk about this lady, Mary Dyer. Was she a Puritan? Was she a Quaker? Yes, she started off as a Puritan in the Massachusetts colony, and when Anne Hutchinson had been banished, she had been one of the people who followed her to the new colony of Portsmouth, which would later become New Hampshire. Now, later on, after Anne Hutchinson moved to the Bronx in the New Netherlands, Mary Dyer went back to England. And when she was in England, she met George Fox, the founder of the Religious Society of Friends, who was a frequent speaker. So she heard him speak. Then she met him. Then she converted from being a Puritan to being a Quaker. And she now had a sense of purpose. She now had a sense of mission. And so she returned to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, from which she had been banished, and returned there and started preaching and proselytizing and trying to convert Puritans into Quakers. And she was caught and arrested and kicked out, and then she came back. And so when she came back, she was arrested again and was one of 4 Quakers who were publicly hanged in Boston on the Boston Common in the year 1660. Now, be sure that you know the difference between Anne Hutchinson and Mary Dyer. All right, well, Quakerism continued to grow, and a very well-to-do Englishman named William Penn converted to be a member of the Religious Society of Friends, or a Quaker, and he established a new colony, a colony that was called Pennsylvania. He was William Penn, so humility isn't one of the things that he cultivated, I guess. That was established in 1680. Pennsylvania, anyone know? Well, I guess we're not in a classroom, so I can't look around for hands, but if you're familiar with the city of Philadelphia, what does that mean? It's the city of brotherly love. And, despite the antics of Philadelphia sports fans nowadays, it was established as a Quaker town, and that's why it was called that, brotherly love. Pennsylvania was meant to be a haven, just as Maryland was to be a haven for Catholics. Pennsylvania was to be a haven for the persecuted Quakers of the New World, a place that they could go. But not only them, all minorities, all religious minorities and ethnic minorities were welcome in Pennsylvania. And Penn, in particular, had a very good relationship with the local Native Americans and was known to be a fair dealer with them. So very similar to Roger Williams in a lot of ways. So that's why Philadelphia is named Philadelphia. That's why Pennsylvania is called the Quaker state. Well, kind of looking at all the things that Puritans were doing in the late 1600s doesn't put them in a good light when they're going around branding people in the face for having different views on Protestantism, or even hanging people for not being Puritans. This is going to lead ultimately to by the end of the 17th century, to some very embarrassing antics for Puritans in New England. And we've already talked about this once. Remember, we talked about the fact that those French and Indian wars that were going on along the borders of Canada and New England had a lot of Puritans really scared that the end of the world was upon them, particularly when the Catholic French and the pagan Native Americans allied together, all spawns of Satan from the point of view of the Puritans. Well, there was some other stuff going on as well that contributed to the paranoia in Puritan New England. 1688 saw the arrival of a new set of monarchs on the English throne. William of Orange, who was Dutch, and his wife Mary, who had a claim to the throne, were invited to come and take over the English throne. It was called the Glorious Revolution, or sometimes the Bloodless Revolution. Didn't require huge amounts of warfare and bloodshed, just, fairly peaceful, amicable exchange to get these new monarchs. Well, guess what people in the Netherlands, where William was from, guess what they were not? Church of England. And yet now, all of a sudden, as the monarchs of England, William and Mary, are the heads of the Church of England. They pushed for and got through Parliament a new law called the Toleration Act, the English Toleration Act of 1690. And what that did was essentially guaranteed English citizens, both in England and in any of its colonies, the right to practice whatever form of Protestantism that they wished. And so this was going to be enforced all through the English colonies. That is one more straw on the camel's back for the Puritans, because they got those problems I talked about before. The French have allied with the Indians, and there's all these attacks. Now there are these non-Puritan, not even Church of England, monarchs on the throne, and they've passed this law saying that the people of the Puritans of New England can no longer brand people in the face or hang them for not being Puritans. My God, what kind of religious oppression is that? That is taking away their freedom. That's how they felt. And so that all added to the sense of paranoia and the sort of apocalyptic world vision of the Puritans that led to the things that happened in Salem, where those people were executed for witchcraft on the flimsiest of evidence, a large number of people. And it's the kind of thing that happens when people's security is threatened. They get paranoid, they get panicky, they get hysterical, they do things that maybe they wouldn't normally do. And once they have done those things, at a certain point, once blood has been shed, at a certain point, people tend to step back and sort of look at what they've done and say, oh my, I may have overreacted a little bit. And that's exactly what happened in New England after the Salem witch trials. After the Salem witch trials, well, the Puritans were humiliated, really, because they had now developed this reputation as insane zealots, murderous zealots, just going around killing people willy-nilly. So there weren't a large number of witchcraft trials after that, after the 1690s, in the New England colonies. And in fact, before very long after that, there were not officially Puritans. The Puritan Church changed its name to the Congregationalist Church. So, if you are reading in a history book, maybe set in the 1800s, or you may encounter someone now that is a Congregationalist, they belong to the group that used to be called the Puritans. All right, well, let's kind of sum up where we are right now. Let's take a look at New England. By the year 1700, you have these colonies. You've got the original Plymouth colony from 1620 and the Massachusetts Bay colony from 1630, which by the end of the century had combined into one colony called Massachusetts. And Maine, way up there to the north of everybody else, was part of. It was a province of Massachusetts. So you got the Massachusetts colony. You have the New Hampshire colony, which grew out of the Portsmouth colony co-established by Anne Hutchinson and her followers. You've got the Rhode Island colony that started as the Providence colony, established by Roger Williams. In 1636, there was a new colony, a Puritan colony called Connecticut, which absorbed the smaller colonies of New Haven. So here you've got now, by 1700, you've got New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut in what is now known as New England. That's 4 colonies. Then, 1660s, the English chased away the Dutch and the Swedes and took over the territory they had held, making the former Dutch colony of New Netherland, whose capital was New Amsterdam, into the new English colony of New York. They also took away the Swedes' territory in Delaware and New Jersey, New Sweden. And so that became the colonies of Delaware and initially East Jersey and West Jersey, which were then combined into just New Jersey. Then 1680, William Penn established the colony of Pennsylvania. So that's 4 we already had to the north in New England, and you add New York, New Jersey, Delaware, and Pennsylvania, and we're up to 8. And then if you look at the bottom of this map, outside the mid-Atlantic area down into the Tidewater, you've also got Maryland, which was established in 1636, and Virginia, which had been the first. So then that makes 10 colonies. Later on, there are the colony of Carolina is established, so that makes 11 colonies. And Carolina was then, in about 1712, broken up into 2 parts, North Carolina and South Carolina. So that makes 11 colonies. And am I forgetting one? Let's see, Maryland, Delaware, Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. Then, finally, about a third of the way into the 1700s, the colony of Georgia is established. We'll talk about that later. Georgia is the 13th English colony along the North American coast. So that gets us to 13 English colonies, which I bet doesn't come as a surprise to most of you. But now you know how we got there.